What are the effects of anti-price gouging laws during hurricanes? And what is the effect of a judicial ruling declaring Google to be a monopoly? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine those two questions. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, and has for many years. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you, of course, and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, so Richard is located right outside of Charleston, South Carolina. I forget the name of your little town, Richard. What is it again?
Mount Pleasant,
Mount Pleasant. And you are in
founded in
the
around 1680 or 1685.
all right, and you are located not yet in the eye of Hurricane Debbie, but it appears that you will soon be. You were telling me before we started broadcasting that you've seen some rain, but that the hurricane is going out to the ocean, but circling back around to Mount Pleasant. So I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to revisit a theme that we've revisited before, and that is the emergency measures that the state inevitably takes whenever this happens, and especially with respect to price gouging. That they feel like they're protecting the citizenry by imposing emergency price controls that prevent people from raising the prices of any items, or at least essential items like water and bottled water and so forth, with the idea that they are really protecting people living in these areas from being gouged by evil, greedy, profit-seeking bourgeois swine of private owners. And as you and I have pointed out over the years, this is just pure destructive economic nonsense. And the shame of it is that we have to keep addressing this issue time and time again because they keep making the same mistake, that when you place these price controls on, you're actually doing a tremendous disservice to people. You are sending a signal that, hey, you don't need to conserve. There's plenty of bottled water here. Just go out and use it to your heart's content. And of course, then people run out immediately, and there's a shortage, and everybody's trying to figure out, well, oh my gosh, why is there a shortage? And at the same time, on the supply side, with prices soaring, which is what the laws of supply and demand would dictate, you've got entrepreneurs that have an incentive to get bottled water in there, make some money, try to make a profit off this situation, and in the process, supply people with water. Once you put the price control on there, the entrepreneur says, why should I risk my life possibly, or my resources to try to get bottled water in there when I can't make a profit off it? And so you actually end up with a worse situation with these price gouging laws than you would otherwise. What do you think, Richard?
Well, I'm just going to reiterate some of the points that you've just made, and it's the crucial role of the price system. Friedrich Hayek, the famous Austrian economist, Nobel Prize winner, argued a long time ago about how knowledge is used in society. We live in a world in which knowledge is imperfect. Um, I know it's hard to believe, but even Jacob Hornberger doesn't know everything. But knowledge is imperfect, and that knowledge is decentralized. You know things that I don't. All of us know things that others in society don't. And this particularly applies to the marketplace. We talk about the specialized knowledge of the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. Uh, but the fact is that the question is that how shall all the knowledge, ability, skills, information that others have about how to do things, where to do things, when to do things, and on the market demand side, where's the demand? How intense is the demand? How does the demand change in terms of time and locality so that there's a constant adaptation, adjustment, rebalancing so that the pattern of supplies of what people want and need is tending to always be moving and gravitating and matching where the demands are. In the intricacy of so many different demands for so many different things, of different degrees of importance to multitudes of us as different individuals, so that the supplies are tending to match the demands. And prices serve as that informational signal. We don't know, we don't have to talk to each other. We don't have to know each other. We don't have to know the whys and the wherefores as to why we want more of something or less of something, and the reasons behind it. All that has to be done is that it's a signal. And if there's an emergency situation such as hurricanes and flooding, suddenly a threat of necessary everyday goods and services, or the types of things that people only need or want during more emergency times, are becoming in short supply, uh, how is the signal sent out that that is where supplies, resources, manpower to do things should be readjusted? And prices serve that purpose. If Charleston suffers from a very severe catastrophe from this circumstance, the forecast says it's not so much to be wind, like you think often in hurricanes. It's the fact that it's going to rotate here for several days, turning and turning, and just torrential rain, flooding, inability to get around very much. Stores will be limited in and run out of supplies to the extent that people can get to those facilities. So how do other people in the surrounding areas, or even hundreds, if not thousands of miles away, discover that that is where the resources, the goods, the services needed should be directed? And the prices will do that. Prices will rise here. And yes, higher prices means that each of us will have to decide, in the lingo of the economist, at the margin, well, how much do I, and how intensely do I really need something? Could I cut back my purchases as the price rises? And now I have to reevaluate whether it's worth paying for that, given other things that I'm using my money for, both now and thinking of when the crisis passes. And therefore, people start rationing themselves in relation to the price on the demand side. But the intensity of the demand in these circumstances acts as the signal for others to come into the area, or to release stocks or extra supplies that might be sitting as inventory, to bring it to where it's wanted as best as travel and communication permits, so that their constant ability to shift resources from where they're greater in supply but are less intensively needed, to where they're in shorter supply and more intensively needed and desired by users in the society. Prices do this, the government can't. When the government talks about these emergency plans, think of the word plan in that. That is government central planning. We know what's needed. We know where it's needed. We know when it's needed. And we're going to allocate these things. You cannot in any way, in a pragmatic sense, to get the necessary adaptive feedback and responses to it in subtle and minute and continuous ways that the market does. Because then you have to wait for the people on top of these emergency planning agencies to be told and find out what's going on, and then decide, well, what's the priorities in their minds as to how it should be apportioned and allocated and redistributed, and then the commands for it to be done in this way. So emergency services by government always will lag behind and be less efficient and adaptive and successful than leaving these things to the market, which means leaving it to all of us to evaluate our situations, and those outside the area as well as inside the area, using their knowledge, abilities, and circumstances to adapt and adjust to our own needs and those of all the others, in ways that the market is subtly doing every day that we don't even notice. But an emergency is sort of like putting it under a microscope. It amplifies what prices do and how effectively when left alone.
Yeah, you're raising two aspects of a market economy: the supply and demand of particular items, as well as the price system that coordinates people's buying and selling. And the first part I was talking about earlier, in terms of that, when there's a shortage or a scarcity of something, the prices are going to go up. It's just a natural law of supply and demand. And that when government tampers with that, with a price ceiling, you're going to have a situation that's actually made worse. Because as you point out, somebody that's got a limited quantity of water, because bottled water is so expensive, he's going to be very careful about how he uses that. he may wash his hands less. He certainly wouldn't be using bottled water to go out and, wash his windshield or something. He's going to be very careful because it's so expensive. And by the same token, as I indicated earlier, the entrepreneur is saying, man, I'm going to get in there and make some money and brave the flooded roads and get that bottled water in there. So that's how the market alleviates this crisis. But as you point out, that central to this is the price system, which is another aspect of the market. And so the price system is a very intricate system. It involves money, how the society turns to a particular item, whether it's gold or silver or cigarettes or whatever, to serve as a medium of exchange, where people acquire the money as a way to go out and buy something from someone else. So there's not just straight barter transactions taking place. And this then points to the importance of a sound money system, which is what we don't have in the United States. We have a paper money system that's governed and managed and planned by the Federal Reserve System, a central bank, that tampers with the money and has ever since its institution, with its flooding the money supply with newly printed money decade after decade. I mean, if you look at the value of the paper dollar over the last many decades, 100 years, is just this downward trajectory. And it's mostly to accommodate out of control federal spending. But it creates these booms and these busts, but it sends a bad signal out to entrepreneurs, to investors, to business people, to consumers, causing them to make decisions that they would not ever even think of doing. And then, of course, comes the recession, where everybody's now realizing what the government has done. And so these two aspects of a market economy are critically important. We can go all the way back to Adam Smith's great treatise, The Wealth of Nations, where Smith talks about both aspects. And the real message that Smith was saying is that your society is better off without government tampering with either thing. The supply and demand of commodities through price controls or price base supports like minimum wage laws. But you're also better off without a government that's tampering with the means of communication in this system, which is the price system. I think the ideal is a constitutional amendment that just separates economy and the state entirely. And that way, if we ever get to a point in this country where we have that constitutional amendment, modeled after the First Amendment, that no law shall be enacted by either the federal or the state governments respecting the regulation of commerce or money or abridging the free exercise thereof, then we don't have to worry about all these price gouging laws or minimum wage laws or any of these other things of the Federal Reserve System that interferes with the proper functioning of a market economy.
Yes. What's important to realize is that this distinction that is sometimes made between human rights and property rights, or civil liberties versus economic freedom, is a false dichotomy. At the end of the day, they're one seamless web of the freedom of the individual. We just talked about prices. Well, on the one hand, there's this distinction of freedom of the press, freedom of speech, but prices are the means by which we communicate with each other. We talk through prices. Think of it as sort of like a Morse code, where it's not a person speaking words, but a shorthand system that has been learned for people to communicate. And that communication is as crucial as a philosophical idea or a textbook about some technical method of doing something, because it involves the everyday affairs of all of us going on all the time to better coordinate ourselves in our mutual interdependency, in which, as you referred to Adam Smith, in the market economy where there's private property and freedom of exchange with a division of labor, each of us in our own self-interest must serve our fellow man as the means to earn the financial wherewithal for us to have the ability to then demand ourselves as consumers all that the others are able to do in terms of products, qualities, costs, that we couldn't do better if we tried to do these things for ourselves. So unless we're able to talk to each other through the medium of prices, the system of discourse gets weakened or collapses. So the freedom of market prices, which requires the freedom of competition, which means the freedom of voluntary exchange, which means the respect for private property and individual choice, is embedded in the notion of what a civil liberty of freedom of speech is all about.
Okay, well, let's shift gears here and go on to another aspect of the market economy. Um, just a few days ago, a federal judge declared that Google was a monopoly and that it's engaged in monopoly practices through its search engine. It says it's locking out competitors out of the market, and it's doing other things that they say are anti-competitive. And so the judges entered that ruling. The Federal Trade Commission is bringing other actions, uh, and it's all designed to punish businesses like Google who have been successful in the marketplace. And this is one of the things that they forget about, Richard. This is what we've been dealing with in antitrust legislation and prosecutions. Gosh, I think ever since 1890, I think that was when the antitrust law was first adopted. It's this notion that if a company is successful, that must mean that it's a monopoly. If successful in the marketplace, and that bigness shows that this is something really bad. Well, actually, it's the exact opposite. Bigness in a regular market economy that's not influenced by the law, by some kind of protective status, is just a response of the consumers. The consumers are saying, we like what this business is doing. We're willing to patronize. We're willing to pay for it. And you've had tremendously successful companies that the government has gone after under monopoly legislation for gosh, over 100 years, when actually it's the consumers that decide these things. If you take, for example, the top 20 companies on the S&P 500, the most successful companies, let's say just 30 years ago, I don't think you'll find any of them in the top 30 today. If you do, it's only like one or two. And that's not because the government went after them and broke them up. It's because this is how markets operate. The free market operates, that consumers find something better, and so they shift. So you don't need government to be breaking up big companies. Consumers do a very good job of that themselves. And so a company knows, even if it's at the top, that if it doesn't satisfy consumers, it's going to lose market share to a competitor. But what they do is they end up punishing success, the government does, with their antitrust prosecutions. And the other thing that I want to emphasize here is that a genuine monopoly is one where the government is in there with laws or rules or regulations that prevent competition. They give a privileged status to a particular company. And this is why there was so much revulsion against monopolies in the late 1800s, because the British government was out there granting monopolies to companies, and they were very abusive. They were very rude to people. Their products were shoddy. Their service was bad. And people came to recoil against monopolies. But what we're talking about monopolies, we're talking about companies or enterprises where the government is saying, you have the exclusive privilege of producing that product, and we're going to shut out any competitors. Okay, the classic example of this is the Postal Service, that they have a monopoly on first-class mail delivery. You try to compete against them in the delivery of first-class mail, they will shut you down immediately. They'll get a Justice Department lawyer to go into federal court, and the federal court will grant an immediate injunction. That's a genuine monopoly. But a big company that has gotten big and successful by satisfying consumers, that is something totally different. What do you think?
Well, let me sort of again pick on some of these things. We have to ask ourselves, what does monopoly mean? Well, the word comes from the Greek. Uh, Mono means one, and poly means seller. So a monopoly is a situation in which there's one seller. Okay. But why is there one seller? There's a variety of reasons for this. The first is that every new idea starts in some one individual's mind. And if sees it that it has some marketable potential and has the willingness to bear the uncertainty and the risk of undertaking an enterprise to bring this idea to market, and if with his own resources or if he can persuade others to lend him the money to do the startup, he's the first one in the market. Now, that's inescapable. At first, there's one new guy with some new idea encapsulated in a product that he's selling to you. Now, the thing is that if we look at it not as a moment in time, but as a dynamic process through time, if this is a situation in which this is not only a product that people want, but in fact desire it enough to result in this original new inventor, thinker, marketer to earn a significant profit, over time, his very profitability will attract others into his market to chip away at the profits that they see can be earned that way. A second member enters the market, a third seller enters the market, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, any number of these. And over time, his market share, that is eating away at his single seller market status, will be eaten away. And his very successes in an open competitive market will attract the rivals who will make the product more available. They'll devise ways to try to make it better, to draw those consumers toward them. And the most effective way is, how can I make it better and as well as less costly to offer the price incentive of a lower market price to attract consumers towards me away from him? Now, a perfect example of this is when Apple began marketing tablets. That is what we call the iPad. If you look at the circumstance, like for the first year or two after Apple started marketing its iPad, its market share was like 98%. I mean, that's about as close to a monopoly you get. But then fast forward several years, their market share fell to 80%, 70%, barely 50%. Why? Because just what I said was at work. Oh, people find this convenient to have something bigger than their cell phone, but not as large as their laptop computer, to carry around with them, with the same features and adaptability and Wi-Fi potential, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So as a consequence, all these other Android and these others came onto the market and ate away at Apple's iPad monopoly, precisely because of its attractiveness, its success, and its profitability, so that we no longer think of Apple having the monopoly in pad marketing, tablet marketing, excuse me. So the other reason why there might be a single seller in a market, the market is too small to be able to sustain more than one seller. Now, for example, I explain this to my students sometimes in class, Jacob, and I'll say, imagine that there's a small rural community and there's a general store. And let's suppose that the number of people, of demanders, the community of demanders, is sufficient given his costs of, let's say, just to pick numbers, like $100 of monthly costs to earn $300, okay? But the problem is let us suppose one or two other general stores were to enter this market, seeing this huge profit margin. But now when the two or three competitors now are trying to gain the business of only a small number of people who have $100 to spend, it may be that none of them now can stay in business. They will have divided up so much of the business between themselves that their revenues won't cover their respective costs. So in fact, it may have to go back to one seller. Now, I had this in Hillsdale, Michigan, when I used to teach at Hillsdale College. There was a supermarket, and it was the supermarket. And then another supermarket opened in town. And at the end of the day, within 2 years, the older one went out of business and the newer one was now the single store. Not because they did anything bad. They were competitively pricing. It was basically the same goods and services. Given the cost of production, the market was not large enough to sustain more than one seller. You might say the market, therefore, is determining how many sellers there should be. And in this case, one. And what is the other major reason why there could be a monopoly? And this is the one that you were emphasizing, Jacob. And that is the government. As you pointed out, when Adam Smith is wailing against the government interventions in the marketplace in The Wealth of Nations back in the 1770s, and he talks about monopolies, what he's criticizing is the government of bestowing privileges and favors and unique production restrictions on anyone except those favored by the king, by the prince, because you would buy that monopoly position by basically agreeing to split the profits that they earn from the monopoly position with the king and his retinue, those around him. So as a consequence, if there was a single seller in the market, that was a situation in which it was frozen in time because no one could come in and competed the customers away. So the essence of monopoly is a problem. That is that monopoly, one seller in the market, only arises when we have the government coming in and inhibiting, preventing, restricting, penalizing anyone who tries to compete. And I'll just finish one other thing here, Jacob, and that is there was a famous economist originally from Austria named Joseph Schumpeter, famous for the theory of entrepreneurship, but he also talked about the process of creative destruction, how the market is an innovative and dynamic process where entrepreneurs imagine new products, better products, ways to make a product less expensively to market it to the same and more consumers in new and improved ways. But he says that if you want to understand the dynamic of the market, you can't look at the market situation as if it's a frozen frame taken out of a motion picture. You need to look at the whole motion picture. Why? How did this single seller arise? Has he been successful or not? How has his very success attracted people? How has it therefore made the market more competitive in attracting the very rivals who undermine the monopoly position? And he said, you have to look at the market not over a day, a week, a month. You have to look at the market over years, sometimes decades, to see the dynamism and the passing significance of a single seller having a particular position at any one moment in time. And I'll just finish with this. You were mentioning that if you look over the decades, what's listed as a big monopoly or market dominating firm. A number of years ago, a free market economist did a study of the Fortune 500s. The Fortune magazine has been putting out these lists of the 500 richest people, the 500 most successful companies or corporations since the 1920s. And I looked at these over the decades. And if you pick a year like 1927, 1935, 1948, 1956, 1964, okay, and you look at the Fortune 500 lists of those selected years, you find out is that companies that were near the top one year are now much lower a few years later. And some that were on the list are gone. And many firms that had never been on these lists earlier are now there. Why? Either they've new and entered the market and hadn't existed earlier, or they have found ways to eat away at the market positions of their existing rivals and competed them out of the market or reduced their share relative to their own. So that is the dynamism of the market. If government stays out of the way and does not give favors, privileges, restrictions, and prohibitions against rivals trying to enter markets to give consumers better versions and less expensive versions of a product that someone has been offering to them, then monopoly is not a problem. Government is the source of the monopoly problem and nothing else.
Yeah, if a so-called monopolist, because he's big, had this overwhelming power, he would never lose. He'd never lose his position in the top 30. It stands by definition, he would just be there forever. And the fact that they have dropped off the list indicates that the problem really doesn't exist. The problem arises only when government is there with a law that provides them the protection from competition.
Yeah, the thing is that I was reading one or two commentaries about this decision that was made by the courts about Google, and one commentator was saying, "See, this shows that these monopolies are a problem created by the market. Look at the telephone industry in the past, AT&T." What this guy doesn't understand is that AT&T was made a national monopoly by the federal government back in the 1920s. you couldn't offer telephone service. You couldn't offer the equipment. You couldn't offer software. And it was only when the government finally took away this monopoly position in the late 70s and the early 1980s that you saw the market bloom with all these means of communication. The way I like to put it is that, for decades, AT&T assured us when it was in this federal monopoly privilege, oh, we've taken telephone service about as far as we can go. And that's the stand on the desk phone. You hold the receiver in your hand. You can go only as far as the cord will take you. And the rotary dial. And then AT&T said, you see, we're not a stagnant company. We are improving things to the consumer's benefit. We've introduced buttons instead of the dial. By golly, as they said in the musical movie Oklahoma, we've gone about as far as we can go, as far as we can go. And the thing is that now when that monopoly was broken up, you immediately saw what? Cordless phones, different types of phones. The marketing of cute phones. You'd have Mickey Mouse cordless phones. You talk into Mickey's belly button, and you listen through his nose. And of course, this was an earlier, less gender sensitive era. There was the special woman's phone for the smaller, more delicate hand, the princess mobile cordless phone to fit the female's hand. Okay. And then they had the flip phones, and then, oh, they've really developed the flip phones because now it's not only a phone, but my God, I can add, subtract, and divide, maybe even multiply. They've gone about as far as they can go. And then this guy named Steve Jobs comes along and he says, you know what? I want a phone that fits in my hand. And with my thumb, I can do all these features. And he tells his technicians and appliers of the technologies, make this. And he comes out with the Apple smartphone, which has revolutionized everything. But this all came about as possible with the elimination of the government privilege that protected AT&T from competition for decades through the 20th century. Once the government privilege was taken away, and you allow some time to pass because everything takes time, the market innovators had a free hand and an open road to give us all that we take for granted. Just think of what we're communicating with this. This didn't exist a couple of decades ago. This has all been made possible by a freer, of course, not a laissez-faire free market. The government's hand is always with its sticky fingers doing something all the time, but freer than those monopoly days of AT&T, so that now we can be even communicating in this way over the internet.
Yeah, and I think one of the important aspects of what you're talking about is that when the government is providing this protection, this monopolistic protection to a company, it's impossible to predict what life would be like without that protection. You don't just think of, oh, a handheld computer, the size it'll fit in your hand. You don't think of something like that. It's because you freed the market that all of a sudden things come into existence, the likes of which nobody could even have imagined. Those are called miracle of a free market. I think it's important also in the context of what we were talking about earlier on the hurricanes, that in the area of money, there is this monopoly. The government has monopoly over the production of money. This is what legal tender laws are all about. They don't want competition with their paper money because they know that with competition, people will come out with better forms of money than the government has, and that people will start gravitating for the better forms of money, the money that's not being inflated and debased like the government money is. And I'd like to just wrap up our discussion, Richard, by talking a little bit about the legal aspects of this. The America goes through the entire 19th century with pretty much free of monopolies. Throughout the 19th century, you had basically a free market. Now, we have big exceptions like slavery and so forth, but by and large, for most of the population, you have a free market. But in the late 1800s, as you know, the move toward socialism, progressivism, and regulation starts taking place. And it's, excuse me, it's a throwback to the old mercantilist regulated economy era. And one of the first cases that arose out of this in the Supreme Court, oh boy, allergy attack.
No, it's because you're allergic to the government, and that's what you're talking about.
Was a case called the Slaughterhouse Cases. And I would invite our listeners and viewers to go take a look on the internet at the Slaughterhouse Cases. Take the time to read them. The opinions, especially the opinion of Stephen Field. It was a fascinating case. The state of New Orleans enacted a monopoly, or a law establishing monopoly for a slaughterhouse in the city of New Orleans. And all the other competing slaughterhouses were required to shut down. Classic example of a monopoly. And it was a throwback to the French economic system of highly regulated industries and economies and so forth. So the slaughterhouses who were shut down brought a lawsuit under the 14th Amendment, which had just been enacted in the aftermath of the Civil War, saying that this law denies us due process of law. And this was the concept of substantive due process that came into existence, where they were saying, we have a right to pursue an occupation. It's a fundamental right of every free person, and that a state cannot deny us that right. And so the case reaches the Supreme Court, and it's really worth reading, especially the dissenting opinions. The court upheld the monopoly, unfortunately, but reading the decisions, both majority and dissent, but especially the dissent, will really give you a good understanding of the history of monopolies, how they came into existence. In fact, the lawyer representing the slaughterhouses who had been shut down was a guy named Campbell. Fascinating guy. He was a lawyer who had served on the U.S. Supreme Court. Lifetime appointment. And the Civil War breaks out, and he feels it's his patriotic duty to return to his home state of Louisiana. He resigns his lifetime appointment. So at the end of the war, he was broke, and he had to start his law practice from scratch, but brilliant guy. And they even commended him in this opinion, in these opinions, saying that his knowledge of monopolies was just amazing in terms of the brief that he filed, the appellate brief. So they go into all of this, and especially in the dissenting opinions, and I'd invite our readers to go and look at that. It's called the Slaughterhouse Cases.
I'll also, for recommending things, is an excellent book by an economist named Dominic Armentano, and it's called Monopoly and Antitrust. And the first couple of chapters is on the economics of monopoly versus competition. It's an excellent, readable, non-technical explanation of the workings of a competitive market versus what monopoly means and the government's role in it. Then he has all of these famous case studies from the time the antitrust laws came in, the Sherman Antitrust Act and so on in the 1890s. And he talks about all of these major cases and debunks the reasoning and the rationale in which government claimed the right to either restrict or break up or prohibit what it was defining as monopoly acts by many of the famous cases at that time. And then I know time is running out, but I'll just in passing mention, since it involves this Google case, that the court was saying that Google, quote, monopolizes its search engine, and through contractual arrangements with those who want Google services have to give priority or build into their devices and smartphones the Google search engine. But has been pointed out both in previous cases and this, is that it is very easy to download another app. It's called the App Store, and you download another search engine. And if you think it is more useful, more convenient, less this, more of that you find either something you don't like or something you want more of, it's easy to do. I switch between two search engines all the time that are both installed on my computer, on my cell phone, on my iPad. It's a stupid idea. Now, if the government said, you can't use any search engine except this search engine, well, then the government is legally prohibiting others from marketing it or offering it. But as long as the market is open enough for you to download a search engine, if you preferred it, there ain't no problem. This is just a smokescreen to cover up what the government wants to do, and that is to micromanage the pattern of the market.
All right. On that excellent note and observation and insight, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all for tuning in. We've got a mid-year fundraising drive taking place right here. We greatly appreciate the help that y'all give us at the end of the year. It gets us through most of the year, but your mid-year support really is really important for us. And if you could help us out here, you'll be getting your fundraising letters, and of course also online. We'd be very, very honored and very, very appreciative. Richard, on that note, as always, I enjoyed the conversation and I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.